A common question that gets asked is, what texture size should I use for my character model? Well, texture size really depends on the kind of game it is and how the character will be viewed. Ideally, this is something you should be thinking about even before you start modeling. But if you haven't made a character before and you're not sure what size to use, then I recommend doing some research on games that are similar to what you want to make and try to match their specifications. Especially if you're a student, I recommend sticking to modest texture sizes. For real-time game models, you should really be able to demonstrate that you understand how to create an optimized model that still looks great. And using 2K maps all the time is not really a challenge for that. There are still a lot of games today that have really great looking models that use just a fraction of, like a 2K map. So, having a larger texture is not going to magically make your texture better. So learn to work within limitations and keep the big picture in mind when evaluating your model's textures. Look at the model from a game viewing distance and not zoomed in all the way on all the details. This can also help you improve your speed by letting you avoid doing work that players are unlikely to notice, because higher resolution textures seriously take a lot longer than a low resolution model, because you have to spend a lot more time trying to get the most out of them so that it stands up to close scrutiny. Normally, you want to stick to texture sizes that are power of 2. Powers of 2 are common computer use because a lot of the science behind it is based off of binary systems. Basically, this means that your textures will tend to be sized in these increments. Usually texture sizes will be square, but you will occasionally come across textures that are an additional power of 2 in one direction, such as having a 512 by 1024 texture. It's technically possible to have other sizes, but you should stick with powers of 2 because if you make your texture even a little bit larger, then the texture won't fit as well into memory, and you end up wasting space that other textures could have used. Unless required otherwise, I like to do the following for texture sizes. And this is not a hard and fast rule by any means. It's just what I like to do. If given the decision to make, this is what I would decide. And that is, if the texture is around 256 or below, then I would work at resolution. In other words, my source file would also be 256. And that's mostly because this is easier to keep things looking sharp and clear with a limited number of pixels. If you work higher than that and you downsize, you run the risk of things kind of getting a little bit blurry. Even if you sharpen it, things will always be better if you place the pixels deliberately at this kind of resolution. At texture resolutions from 512 to 1K, I like to work at 2 times that resolution. It's usually safe to resize and sharpen the texture, and after you're done with it, and that produces a good enough result for me. So once you start getting into textures that are 2K or larger, then I start to work at that resolution again, and that's because the files just become really unwieldy. Unless you have a very powerful machine with like tons of RAM, working with 4K texture maps, with tons of layers and stuff, that can really kill your machine, and everything will slow down. So again, these are just guidelines that I like to use for myself. Obviously, whatever, depending on whatever project you have, they may have different requirements. But aside from that, before you commit to fully texturing, it's a good idea to try some test bakes to make sure that the decisions you made when laying out your UVs were actually the right ones. If things aren't looking good, then you might have to re-examine your UV layout and even how you may have modeled some things before resorting to something like increasing the texture size, because in most cases that texture size limitation is not something that can budge. In a game production, it's a lot easier to go down than to go up on texture sizes, because that's one of those things where it's a big hit on performance. So instead of asking your boss for more texture space, what you really probably should be doing is finding ways to reallocate your UVs, or to simplify your modeling for a better result in game. Sometimes this means sacrificing details, but keep the big picture in mind about whether or not those details are really crucial, because sometimes what's important to you as an artist and what is important to the game and the gameplay can be very different things. So I'm not saying that you can't ever push for higher resolutions, because obviously sometimes it becomes a necessity, but it's usually one of those last resort things.